really happy to have Marlon here. Happy to have you here. Is you have a new book out. I have your first book, which I loved. I'm holding this up so everyone can see this now. Black Champions in Cycling. I thought it was amazing. We talked about it. I talked with you. I think it's a really important book, and I think your new book. I don't actually have the book. But I do have the PDF.
Look.
This is new. There we go. New Black Cyclones. This book, I think, is really challenging to read in a great way. Like if you have this great point in your book. If I just walk down the street and ask people, or if I show up to any group ride and ask people to name a famous cyclist, it's probably going to be a white dude. Someone might come up with like Egan Bernal, who was the first Colombian to win the Tour. So there might be someone else, but it's just primarily because of the way it has, come up through Europe, and you talk about this a lot. It's a white sport at that level. You've spent a lot of time in the U.S., especially with some of my friends and riding friends down there in Philly. The Kings will together and Queens will together, and Turan and Prince down there, and you've been to all clubs, and you've been to One Love. So there is this really interesting influx of Black cyclists at that level. When you still look at the elites, we're all going to talk about Biniam Girmay, right?
Yeah.
And that's it. And you try to understand why and how we can change this. And I found some of that really challenging myself, to my point of view. And not that I disagree with you, but I don't understand parts of it.
No, Bill. I mean, I'm really, as I said at the top of this, you've written so many things, you've done so many things in cycling publishing, you love the sport just like me. And just having your opinion on this, whether you don't understand, whether you do understand, just having a conversation about it is great. And you mentioned the Black Champions in cycling. That was me aiming to find out why. Why haven't there been more people like me, especially from the UK, representing Great Britain at the Olympic Games or the World Championships, for seniors? And I guess, I kind of found out some answers from the first book via that autoethnographic approach, where I take my story and I pitch my story against the stories of people who've been before me. Maurice Burton, Russell Williams, David Clark, Christian Light, those guys who have engaged with British cycling, and you hear about what the challenges were for them to have that representation, and how that representation wasn't possible for them because of discrimination, and how they forged their own paths in the sport in order to sort of achieve what they wanted to achieve. And I guess with New Black Cyclones, I kind of take that particular template from the first book, and I kind of extend that across, my explorations of the USA, which I did in the first book as well, but also across Africa. And of course, we have Biniam Girmay, who is exalted, venerated by the cycling media as this almost Jesus Christ figure,
right? You put us in there.
Well, we do, and because that's what we do with sport, or even other elements of life, whether it be acting or this is what we do. We want to see a heroine and a hero. We want to see a paragon. We want to see this role model. And I think what's interesting about this for me is that the guy, he's just an amazing bike rider. This sprint is just out of this world. I mean, as a cyclist, we know this. This guy is phenomenal.
So real quick, Biniam Girmay, first Black cyclist. I know, and we can talk about why that term is weird, but first Black cyclist to win a stage of the Tour de France, 2024. Yeah. Is that right?
2024, yeah. And won three. He won three stages there.
So context on who Biniam is. And
that's the context.
Position to win, uphill sprints, flat out sprints. Amazing bike racer.
Amazing bike racer, and he actually prefers the uphill sprints to the flat sprints, I think, which is interesting. But no, I mean the first Black, that particular term, to win in the Tour de France. And point number one is that there's all this attention to this Black African rider company, as being venerated, and there's all of this attention on what that could mean to sort of black people in Africa in terms of cycling. And I think what I've argued, well, I know what I've argued in my book is that that almost diverts attention away from the issues in the Western countries where cycling is strong. So in the UK and Great Britain, you could, if I were to walk into London tomorrow, I'd find 100 people that look just like Biniam Girmay, and that could probably race like Biniam Girmay. Same for the USA, same for France, the Netherlands, Germany. It almost like erases responsibility from those, or any sense of responsibility from those federations to include sort of black people in the programs. I mean, they might be doing that now, but we haven't seen anything over the last, we haven't seen anything like that from the Western nations where, the resources for cycling, the velodromes, the programs could produce people like that. So it's almost like shifting the responsibility or the focus to Africa. And I think that's quite unfair because the African countries don't have those resources. They don't have those resources.
Which you go into in your book. They just can't. Sometimes people try to help, but it actually ends up being almost counterproductive. You talk about the flood of bike clothing or bike parts that just sit there unused because the infrastructure isn't there to use it.
I mean, there was this charity that had 25 a huge box of cycling shoes that was donated, but they didn't have the cleats. Right. They couldn't get the cleats to put on the shoes. So almost like, well, we can't get the cleats because the people dropping them off didn't send the cleats, so we need to wait for that if they ever come along. Rather than tokenistic approaches, which some people might not see it like that. It can come across like that, and I've kind of explained that in a couple of chapters as well.
That's one thing I found really interesting, is that this is complicated, right? And so, when I got to the part about like when you were talking about Girmay, so I'm someone like, I know that I'm a Tour de France geek. I know that Luis Herrera was the first Colombian, and I know the great Raul Alcala was the first Mexican, to win a stage in the Tour. I know like Raleigh was the first bike produced in an English-speaking company to win the Tour under Jules Zoetemelk. Like, I'm sort of a nut that way. And so I was like, why wouldn't we talk about how great it is that this guy's the first black cyclist? But then as I stuck with your book, at first I was like, what, Marlon, But then as I stuck with the book and I kept reading, I came to this realization: I've never described Herrera as the first brown cyclist to win a stage of the Tour de France. And so it just, I don't know the answer there, but I was like, okay, Marlon's on something. I just love the way you challenge what seems to be common sense. And at the end, you know what? Donate the shoes, but guess what? You've just created another problem. Like, this is not easy, is what I came away with the understanding.
It's not. This sort of comparison between white and black just continues through the sport of cycling. It's almost as if, like, as I say in the book, that the way in which blacks being sort of using that term is as if, like, wait a minute, they've broken through. It's 2024 now, but a black person's broken through into the white world, and they can achieve at our level. And isn't it amazing? I think you can either look at that through those particular lenses as something that's been euphoric about, or you can almost say, well, this is shameful to your particular narcissistic world for only seeing black people now, if you want. So it's complicated, and I think so the Tour de France is given that credibility and sense of validity, but only certain people can access that in order to be raised up to be called the greatest. So, I mean, at the very beginning of the book, I speak about Major Taylor and his exploits across Europe, and how Major Taylor, the first black world champion for sprinting from the USA, how from my experiences of coming to the USA and seeing how so many clubs, Major Taylor Chicago, Major Taylor New York,
Taylor clubs love you.
But the very fact is that this cyclist, there's life after death, and there's perpetual life after death for this guy. And there was a poll after, I think it was after the 22 Tour de France, and it was asking who's the greatest cyclist. And it was just, what happened there was the choices were typical Eurocentric: Merckx, Kinnell, I think Marion Voss, and other. So Major Taylor wasn't even in there. I mean, after Merckx passes away, maybe there might be hundreds of clubs named, Merckx Paris, Merckx Amsterdam. We don't know. But this guy is got life after death, and there's people writing books about him. Naming trails after him. I kind of put in, well, maybe Major Taylor's the greatest cyclist to have ever lived, not this typical Eurocentric perspective that is imposed upon us based upon the Tour de France. So that's what I mean. I guess that's what in terms of challenging common sense, that's what this book is trying to do. It's just trying to sort of challenge that narrow framework of seeing cycling, the way cycling's represented, to look at it in a more sort of global perspective, really, through through the lives of black cyclists and people who love the sport across the African continent as well.
What I would say, read this book, stick with it, because you're going to disagree. Especially I'm talking to our, the white audience bicycling right now. Stick with the book and don't worry about whether something is right or wrong, but just I just found it fascinating to do that and question myself. So in my particular position, if we don't say Biniam is the first black cyclist to win a tour stage, we're going to get creamed. But if we do say it, I now understand what you're saying, which is we're negating a lot and we're just sort of playing along. But what I came to understand reading your book is we have to say that anyway and realize it's kind of wrong and also kind of right. But it doesn't matter whether you're wrong or right. You just sort of stick with it and keep going.
Biniam Girmay is, as soon as he won those races, I mean, his country, Eritrea, were claiming him as their hero, but it was the UCI who was saying, actually, he wouldn't have been there unless he went for our particular school. Okay, so, I mean, he may have been farmed in Eritrea, but he was factoried in Europe. Okay, and therefore he belongs to us, probably more so than he belongs to you. And I think you're right. I mean, for your listeners, this book here, you have to stick with it. You're right, because I am challenging the reader a lot. If you take it chapter by chapter and take a step back from what is imposed upon us as common sense, and aim to sort of understand the power dimensions in which the sport is represented, then you might see some of the points I'm making in this book. I mean, there was a chapter about a guy called Taylor Gagan Hart. There's a chapter that I write about him taking the knee during Black Lives Matters, and I kind of critique it. And that particular chapter was quite that was a big chapter in terms of whether this book was going to get published or not, to tell the truth.
When I read that chapter, I was like, you're being unfair to Teo. And then I stuck with the chapter and I saw your point.
I actually congratulate Teo, and I say how brave he was. He was flipping brave for what he did, because he felt it. I think he felt it. He was probably very but I think what I was trying to explain there is that the white guy, I mean, Justin Williams was raising his fist all the time, but the white guy got more attention than the black guy for doing it. And the white guy's power in that the way in which I define the white guy's power in that respect was he was able to sanction, he was able to sort of almost appeal to the white world of cycling and say, look, I want to do this. I want this to happen. I want to bring a black guy into World Tour cycling. Because I'm Taylor Gagan Hart, I can do this. And so he was almost sort of applying his sense of white power to do that. And it didn't manifest in the way he probably wanted it to manifest. But I think another thing as well, Bill, is the way in which the media were applauding it without being critical about it. So I think what I was trying to do there was I was just trying to sort of put a black cyclist, black author's perspective on that the media weren't doing. And I think I think it came out okay. I mean, I think I'm quite fair, you know, in terms of the way in
I
which I
think
speak
it
about
came out
certain
great.
things.
It came out great. I got all that, and thought, it never occurred to me when it happened to critique it, and it just takes me back to that, like, yeah, bravo to Teo for doing that. It did take a lot of courage, and
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure it couldn't have been easy, given the environment at the time. But also, as you're saying, hey, this also isn't ideal here for these reasons. And you just have to incorporate all of that if we're ever going to change anything, which I think we should, because look, I want everyone in the world to ride a bike, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's what we're going toward. One other place I went at when I was reading your book, I was like, yeah, but Europe is the seat of cycling. Of course, it's Eurocentric. And I was like, you know what? It's just like sumo wrestling. It's a Japanese sport. But then so I questioned myself and I looked into this, and sumo is actually more integrated in terms of people from other countries than cycling is. There's like, this is crazy to me. There's like 550 the highest level professional sumo wrestlers, and there's like 186 from countries outside of Japan. So
Really?
sumo wrestling, which we think of as like just so Japanese, is actually
Yeah.
embraced the world more than cycling had at the professional level, professional racing level for cycling, professional wrestling for sumo. And so that's just
Yeah.
one of the things, like, that's not in your book, but reading your book in trying to kind of refute it for myself, so I would feel better about the tour because I love the tour, but not accepting my own answer. I went to this and I was actually, no, you can be Eurocentric, you can be based in like Japanese culture, but it doesn't mean you need to grind to a halt there. And so it did help me realize cycling has done a terrible job at the upper level, like of opening its doors to racers all across the world.
That's a fantastic point you make about sumo wrestling because it's cultural. It's a cultural, and so is the way in which we know cycling. Tour de France is the first thing that comes to someone's mind. As that is the epitome of cycling culture, and that is where we learn about our cycling gods, if you want. But one thing that occurred to me, especially when I was in the African continent, in South Africa, and in Rwanda to a certain extent, is that, and I said this earlier on in our discussion, there's so many different disciplines of cycling, all right? And when I was in South Africa, I forgot what the name they gave to these bicycles. I was in the townships, but what this club called Bike Bandits do with Iboni is that they have these races and on these sort of like, they're not track bikes, almost like rally choppers. You know those rally choppers? Do you remember the rally
Yeah.
choppers? They're almost like they've got a 27 wheel on the back and a 24 on the front. Okay, in terms of size, and they do these dead sprints along the street, and they just race each other, and that's the way in which they enjoy their culture of cycling. Okay, the point I'm going to make is that just the other day, I didn't know this, but the UCI have validated a world championships for mountain snow biking. So it's almost like downhill slalom on a mountain bike. The UCI, so that's another discipline. It's a particular culture, but the UCI validated that. Now it's when the UCI validate what's happening in that South African township, yeah, for their particular cultural form of cycling. That is where once it recognizes different ways of doing cycling, then there might be a sense of equity and equality in that respect. But at the moment, that thing that was happening, that mountain bike snowboarding is happening in Europe. Again, only certain people can access that to be given the credibility and validity of being a world champion. You won't become a UCI world champion for what's happening in that South African township. So culture, I think it's about recognizing other cultural forms and how and where they originate from.
Marlon, I think we have to wrap up soon. Do you want to, like, any final thoughts you want to?
I've learned a lot by coming to the USA, Bill. You know, meeting you, meeting people in the USA over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, just a few months ago. Learning about the love of the sport, particularly in the Black communities. As we said at the top of this discussion, there were some phenomenal groups that have been led by Black people, but they're very inclusive. It's not just all Black people riding. There might be Black dominant, but there are of mixed ethnicities. So it's great to see that the sport's being led and represented in that particular way, and the bicycle's for everybody. And there are different forms of cycling. As we said at the top, you were really good at Brompton racing. I've never ridden a Brompton bicycle. But I've got to do that before I pass, to say that I've done that discipline. So that's something new for me and something exciting to perhaps do in the sport. And I think that's what cycling can do. It can open up new avenues and new journeys. So yeah, how far can the bicycle take you, as I say in the first chapter in my book?
All the way.
All the way to wherever you want to go and to new things. So love the sport, love the bicycle. That's what I say.